One boy, two bills and a fry-up. What's that got to do with Wes Streeting, title of his new book? Tell me about the title.
Well, the one boy is me. The two bills are my two grandfathers. One on my mum's side of the family, in and out of prison throughout my mum's childhood, my childhood.
Was a bank robber?
Yeah, he had a string of convictions for armed robbery, evidently not very good at it, which is why he was in and out of prison so very often. And then on my dad's side of the family, a very different Bill Streeting, who was a World War II Royal Navy veteran, civil engineer throughout his career, and sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, sort of working class Tory, devout Christian, so very, very different characters. And then the fry-up is the fry-up that my mum had on the day that she was supposed to have an abortion. My mum was very young. She was, I think, 18 when she was pregnant with me. My dad was 17. And there was consensus across the family that she shouldn't go through with the termination. So she did what she was not supposed to.
She should go through with the termination.
Oh, sorry, she should go through. She was determined she shouldn't go through with it. So she did the very thing that she was explicitly told not to do, which was to have breakfast. So it is literally the fry-up that saved my life.
Amazing. What was Christmas like with your two grandfathers? Did they ever get together?
No, not particularly. I mean, the two families knew each other, and my mum and my dad have always been in my life, although their relationship did not last, unsurprisingly. But no, they're very different characters and very different outlooks, very different sets of values, obviously. Although one thing I would say, not by way of defence, but probably by way of mitigation for my mum's dad, Bill Crowley, who was, as I say, in that prison. Yeah. One of the things that he revealed very much later in his life was that when he was growing up, he was subjected to really awful abuse at the hands of his father, both physical and sexual abuse. And when he revealed that, I think so much else made sense. It explained why he came into contact with Borstal and the approved school system very early on. I think his first offence was at the age of 8. And he maintained that relationship with the criminal justice system throughout his life, and I think almost became institutionalised by it. And you can understand why even the harsh conditions of Borstal might feel like a safer and more comfortable place than home, given what he was subjected to when he was growing up.
I'm settling in. Take me back to the East End and what happened to you.
So I'm a lifelong East Ender. So I was brought up in Stepney in East London, lived with my mum for the first half of my childhood, growing up on a council estate in Stepney. I think it's sort of fair to say that what we experienced growing up was pretty tough. I mean, my mum when she did have work, it was low paid and insecure, things like silver service waitressing or working behind bars. And I guess one of the ironies is that the council flat that I was growing up in wasn't a very nice place. We experienced power outages when the electric meter ran out and the money had run out too. We had issues with things like cockroaches and fleas occasionally. And yet, the council flat that I wanted to escape when I was growing up is now something that kids growing up in my constituency aspire to, because kids nowadays are being pushed from pillar to post in temporary accommodation. And so lots of the foundational security that I experienced growing up, well, I wouldn't have described it in those terms or necessarily seen it in those terms at the time. The support network of the extended family, a great state education that enabled me to go from where I grew up to where I am today, the social security safety net. I think a lot of that has been eroded actually in the last 30 years.
Why didn't you stay with your mum throughout your childhood?
Well, we got to a point where home life became quite disruptive. One of my mum's relationships broke down. We moved quite a few times, and at one point my mum was actually moving into temporary accommodation before getting another council flat. And I went to live with my dad, who, the home life with my dad was much more secure, much more settled. And I sort of had to make that choice, really, that, dad's felt like a more secure place, more settled place to be. And so I made that choice at the age of sort of 13 or 14 to live with my dad instead of my mum.
How difficult was that decision?
the decision was not very difficult at all. Telling my mum was probably the hardest conversation I've ever had in my entire life. And to be fair to her, she couldn't have made it easier, because all she wanted for me was what would make me happy, support my schooling in particular. So, in terms of how she received the news, although it would have been very painful for her, she couldn't have made it easier for me if she tried.
And was it difficult for you to talk to your parents about how you wanted to live your life?
Well, I'm very lucky. My parents have always supported me, always encouraged me to aim high, always supported me in terms of my education aspirations. The one thing that I did find hard to share with my parents, with whom I've always had a close relationship, a very open relationship, was when I was at university, I finally came out as gay. And although I told my friends at university, who again couldn't have reacted better, it was the irony of going from a very working class family to Cambridge University, and people saying, you're going to fit in, is this going to be a place for someone like you? It ironically was the place where I'd felt most comfortable to be myself, and my friends couldn't have made it easier. But I was anxious about my family reaction, and was worried about, I think, the thing that lots of young LGBT worry about: will my family react well? If they don't, what will that mean for our relationship? What will it mean for home life? And those were unwarranted fears, actually. Again, my mum and dad's reaction was great. In fact, my dad's only upset was that I hadn't told him. And I think, like lots of parents, they inevitably had all sorts of questions and anxieties. Would my life be harder? Would I be discriminated against? But as I often say to people, younger generations now who are going through the same thing and worried about parents' reactions, it took me years and years to accept myself and to understand who I was. I think you can sometimes afford your parents a few days or a few weeks if they're struggling to come to terms with it a bit.
You mentioned Cambridge University there. Fantastic that you managed to get to Cambridge. What was life like at Cambridge? You said that you felt that you'd fitted in. Yeah,
I absolutely loved it. And I met people from backgrounds I'd never met before. I'd never met anyone who'd gone to private school. When I was growing up in my primary school and secondary school, they were very diverse schools, ethnically and religiously. But with the exception of a handful of middle-class kids in both schools, you were either poor or really poor. In some ways, the two strands of my family were represented in my classmates. So, a working class family and a family that, on the other side that found it much harder. And so rubbing shoulders with people who'd gone to some of the country's top private schools was different. But one of the things I noticed very quickly is that while they didn't have material concerns in terms of their finances, income, they certainly weren't going back home from university and working full-time in the way that I was to pay my way through. They had lots of the same anxieties that we all have about life, whether we're doing well enough, whether we can cope, whether we're, feeling comfortable in our own skins. I think lots of anxieties that I think we all go through in life. It taught me a lot about people from different backgrounds, and I feel very passionate about getting more working class kids to university, to our elite universities in particular.
Why is that the Holy Grail, though? Why is that the Holy Grail?
Well, it doesn't need to be the Holy Grail.
I didn't go to university.
No, and it doesn't need to be the Holy Grail. And look, you had Angela Rayner on your sofa this morning. We come from very similar backgrounds. I think actually in so many respects, Angela had it even harder than I did when she was growing up. But look at where she is today, and she's come through the University of Life. She's worked her way up through the trade union movement, and she is, I hope, on course to be the country's next Deputy Prime Minister. What a phenomenal achievement. I think there are things that we can do to make life easier for kids from mine and Angela's background, whether that's going to university, getting an apprenticeship. I think lots of the country's employers that would consider themselves elite and would acknowledge sometimes they've been elitist are now opening up more school leaver routes and providing school leaver entry routes into kids from working class backgrounds and opportunities to earn and learn and work their way up the business. We need more of all of that. But there's no doubt in my mind that sort of going to Cambridge and actually getting involved in student politics as well, which is often derided, both of those things were engines for social mobility for me and have given me opportunities that lots of people from my sort of background wouldn't have had, especially at that stage in my life.
Which aspects of your life so far will contribute to you being a good Prime Minister?
Well, hopefully I'll be the next Health Secretary. And I think that, well, there's lots of things actually. One is, I genuinely think, and I genuinely don't mean this in an unkind way, I genuinely think that having more people sat around the cabinet table who come from normal or even humble backgrounds will make a difference to our ability to serve the interests of the whole country. And this is my sort of fundamental criticism of the Conservative Party in a way, is that it's not that I think they are these sort of stereotypical villains.
I don't want to talk about this.
No, but you know what I mean?
I want to talk about you. When do you want to be Prime Minister?
Well, I want to be the country's next Health Secretary.
When do you want to be Prime Minister?
I want to be the country's next Health
When do
Secretary.
you want to
This is
be
such
Prime
a
Minister?
tedious round of questions.
No, it's
So I'm
not.
not indulging any more of this.
Yeah, OK.
You know, as I've always been honest
You've
about
got so
the
much
fact.
more charisma than the man that wants to be the Prime Minister.
I think that when you look at where the Labour Party is today, we wouldn't doubt, any of us, that the state of the Conservative Party and the implosion of the SNP have put wind in Labour's sails, but the only reason that Labour Party has sails on the ship is because of Keir's leadership. He took us from the worst defeat since 1935 to being in a position where people not only think Labour could win the next general election, in some cases they expect Labour to win the next general election. Now, we're not that complacent, but he has gripped the Labour Party, he has changed the Labour Party and put it on a course where we could win the next general election. And I think he would be an outstanding Prime Minister for the country. I genuinely do.
OK.
Not just because of his professional background and having run a big public service, but because of his values, what motivates him, and because of where he's come from in life. He wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's not had everything handed to him on a plate. He has worked for everything that he has built.
You talk to me about your health. You had a terrible health scare.
I did a couple of years ago. I went through kidney cancer, and it's actually made me, when Keir asked me to be the Shadow Health Secretary, I was absolutely thrilled. I love the NHS. I love what is given to our country for 75 years. I love the fact that when I went through kidney cancer, the one thing I didn't have to worry about was the bill. But there are lots of things that are wrong with the NHS too. I saw a bit of it in terms of my own experience, in terms of some of the delays in getting scans sorted, some of the follow-up after my operation wasn't particularly great, and some of my follow-up, in fact, none of my follow-up scans have ever been on time, which I think is something lots of people identify with if they're in the backlogs, which are now at record levels.
Doesn't help with the doctor strike.
No, it really doesn't. The junior doctor strike today, the consultant strike next week, on top of more than 600,000 delayed and cancelled operations. This is a disaster for the National Health Service, an absolute disaster. What I find extraordinary, I mean, I'm the second Labour politician on your sofa this morning. Where are government ministers today? They're not in negotiations. They're not on the airwaves explaining what's going on or apologising or telling us what's going to happen. Where are they? It's a total abdication of leadership. And none of this was inevitable, by the way. Before Christmas, the nurses said, the Royal College of Nursing and Unison both said, we'll call a fast strike action if the government simply sit down and talk to us. And the government refused. So then the nurses went out on strike, and once they went out, it was hard for the government to get them back. The junior doctors felt completely unheard. They went out on strike. And then extraordinarily, for the consultants to go on strike, I just think this is a total vote of no confidence in the government on the part of the entire NHS workforce, and it is a disaster for patients. And I don't think the NHS staff do want to be on strike. I think that they have been forced to this position by a government that hasn't listened and has consistently run down the National Health Service over more than a decade. And yes, of course, this is partly about their pay and conditions as the staff of the NHS, but you talk to any of them and they'll tell you this is about patients too. Okay. And the fact they slog their guts out at work and get home at the end of the day knowing their best wasn't good enough through no fault of their own.
One boy, two bills and a fry-up. It's doing rather well in the bestseller chart, I noticed.
It did. I was really chuffed, actually. And the nicest thing is people can write to me as well because my email address is publicly available. The people who've written to me saying how much they identify with it, those are the reviews that meant the most to me.
OK, cover of the book for you there. It's good to see you.
Nice
Thank you very much
Thanks
indeed for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it.